Our moderator for today's discussion, Professor Aman Mahajan, who's the Peter and Eva Safar Professor and Chair at the University of Pittsburgh. With that, I'd like to pass over the discussion to Dr. Mahajan. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for the introduction, and thank you, everybody, for joining in on this very important topic. Diversity and inclusion in clinical trials is a very important subject matter that impacts both health and healthcare in the United States. And we're fortunate to have this distinguished panel of speakers today. They are leaders in their field and represent both academia as well as industry. And without much ado, I'll jump into some of the questions that we've had, some questions that our audience and would like to know as well. And I'd like to ask these questions to each of our speakers and hopefully learning from their experiences and their perspectives. So starting off with Albert, what do you think are the current gaps in diversity and inclusion in clinical research? And what are you currently working on within your organization to address these gaps?
Well, thank you. First of all, I'd like to just say I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And I would be delighted to share some of my insight. I had the opportunity to talk with people in our cancer center. And one of the main problems is the following is basically, I quote an email where they just said, we're not looking very good, and this is at UCLA, in terms of diversity of our cancer clinical trials in relation to the cancer patient population in the Los Angeles County. While we do accrue fairly proportionally based on who walks through the door as a health system, we are not seeing properly that reflecting the diversity of cancer patients in the county. So I think that already just tells us something about, we can only do as well as who walks through the door. So obviously, if we can improve upon that, and I think here at UCLA, we're starting to do that. But I think we also realize what a big task that is ahead of us. I thought it would be useful to really kind of propel the discussion by just talking about 3 patients that I've considered or have put into clinical trials just in the last 1 or 2 weeks. So one of the patients is and I just saw him yesterday, 55-year-old male with recurrent glioblastoma. He's a veteran, he's single, very mild cognitive impairment because of his tumor. He does drive to all of his appointments unaccompanied. He lives with his elderly mother who actually helps him with his meals, but he's essentially in charge of his own medical care. We saw him and he had an MRI scan that showed recurrence, and I was thinking about new treatments for him because the old ones were not working. And we have an exciting trial here that involves immunotherapy and additional surgery. Ultimately, after discussing with him for several minutes, I decided, or at least we decided together, that maybe the clinical trial may not be good for him simply because he has to maneuver through this whole situation on his own. However, I just heard from our nurse navigator that he's thinking about whether he can get a whole team of people to help drive him and get him to that visit. Another patient has a recurrent low-grade glioma. He's 44 years old, also male. This disease happens to be more male disproportionately targeting. He's out of state from the Pacific Northwest. He's single. He has family in the LA area. He was referred by a local neuro-oncologist to think about a trial down at UCLA. And so he's very motivated to come down, and it looks like he will enroll in a clinical trial, despite having to come down to UCLA 3 times, monthly. And then the last one is a 69-year-old male with a recurrent glioblastoma. He's married. He's living in Santa Barbara. He is actually participating in this surgical immunotherapy trial. His spouse accompanies him to all appointments, drives him, advocates for him, and he came to us through a local UCLA community oncologist. And so I think thinking about what are the impediments that the first patient might have versus the impediments that the other 2 patients don't have, and how we can address all of those things, including how do we improve on the diversity of the patient that walks in the door, which ultimately is our ultimate limitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Albert, for sharing. And I want to ask Greg, since he's also part of the academic circle, and what are how he views as the current gaps in here. And again, Albert pointed out to some key areas here. Greg, what has been your experience?
Yeah, so thank you guys for inviting me to participate today. It's very exciting to be part of this group. I'm a pediatric endocrinologist, so I take care of kids with type 1 diabetes. And my area of research is on developing new technologies and therapies for kids with type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes, for genetic reasons that I'm not going to get into, is about 85-90% Caucasian in the United States. That has to do with HLA genotype preponderance, and that's very well known. And so as a result of that, our clinical trials have historically been predominantly Caucasian in their participation. But lately, we've been looking at kind of the effect of these therapies on the broader patient population, and we've seen that the use of the devices, the technologies that we're developing, is sort of mirroring who's in the trials. And a lot of providers and a lot of patients and families aren't uptaking the technology, feeling like it's not well demonstrated in their populations. And so as a result of that, we're seeing this big gap in care between what our Caucasian patients are seeing for their diabetes care and what our non-Caucasian patients are seeing for their diabetes care. And that is a big problem. And so Albert talked about something really important there, which is who walks in the door. And we are now needing to say, well, we need to actually over-recruit. We need to overpower relative to population preponderance, certain groups, so that we can demonstrate to the providers, the payers, and the families that these things actually help them and help close this gap in real world outcomes that we're seeing. And so I mentioned when we were just chatting earlier, I didn't start out interested specifically in this. I'm a huge kind of tech nerd, and I was interested in the electronics, but then seeing a gap in who gets to use the electronics that we develop, I've said, this is a real problem. I want to be getting involved with it. And I'm still learning aspects of this, but we really see the need. And that's where people like me kind of on the front line are moving from.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that perspective. Very relevant. I'd like to ask our colleagues from industry, and frequently, as all of you can appreciate, no great research and outcomes can come without a close collaboration between academia and industry. So I'd like to call upon Jennifer to share your experiences and what your group at Abbott's been doing.
Thank you for having me. I really am an honor to be with these esteemed colleagues, I would say, here, and being invited. When we think about our trials that we do at Abbott, and specifically in the vascular division that I run, the Global Clinical Affairs organization, we are dealing with chronic conditions, chronic diseases. And the challenge that we know is that that these chronic conditions are overly burdened by a diverse population. People of color really are the highest, carry the share of the burden when it comes to peripheral artery disease, coronary artery disease, diabetes. And the challenge that we have is that as we develop these therapies, we need to set goals that our populations are actually representative of those who are burdened by the disease of the new therapy that we are evaluating. And that has not always been the case. And if we actually look at some recent data in 2020 from FDA, we see that across the biologics and drugs that were approved in 2020, and there were about 32,000 patients who were in trials, we still see it was 75% white. And so and Greg, I think you and Albert touched on something, is that we now will be developing therapies where we have a disparity in saying, okay, I don't think this was evaluated on this population. I think, Greg, that's what you're hearing from your patient population. And that's problematic. And we've even talked to physicians who work with us who said, I have a challenge which I want to say to my patients, yes, this was evaluated on you. So at Abbott, we've been trying to determine, how do we do this, and how do we identify the barriers that are limiting patient access or limiting patient trust? And it is multi-layered and multifaceted. And something that, Albert, that you mentioned regarding your patient and transportation, it sounds so simple, but it is so true. And so one of the part of our, structure of programs is something as simple as transportation. But Albert, I think I want to touch on something that you mentioned earlier, is that when do you cross the line of, I'm giving you all these resources, and is it more coercive than just doing trial work? And when I look at certain populations that we want to make sure that they have access, I don't know how we don't offer these services, because we're dealing with a larger health and inequality system. And I believe that as industry, academia, general clinicians, we actually have an obligation to overextend within ethics, but to do better than we have been, because traditionally, as these trials have been run, there haven't always been the development of programs that make it easier and minimize the barrier for the patients to, number one, feel trust within the health network and have the access that they need, and have even an understanding of what possibilities this trial could offer to them or the communities that they come from. So, I think I could go on for quite a bit of time, but I think this is kind of the approach that Abbott is taking, and looking at what do we need to do to participate and actually help shift the dynamic when it comes to patient access with these trials.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's perfectly stated, and highlights the point I was making about the much needed collaboration between the industry and all stakeholders over here. Siavash, you are a practicing clinician, and you also work for Anthem. Could you share your perspective as well?
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks for having me. It's great to be on this panel. Jennifer just mentioned it. We all of this operates within a system that is fundamentally broken when it comes to the way Black and brown people experience life in American society, right? And so everything we have, every system, including clinical trials, and our clinical care system reflect that. And so what are some of the main things I'm talking about here? When it comes to trials, trialist representation, right? Similarly to providing medicine, right? Folks who are engaged in trials, engaged in recruiting, engaged in designing these studies in almost any field in medicine or healthcare should represent the folks that are that should be in those trials and should be represented in those trials, right? Being Black or brown and having a physician that looks like you is therapeutic, right? So when we're thinking about bringing people into clinical trials, gaining trust and engaging with communities that are traditionally underrepresented, the folks doing that have to look like them. And I think that's extremely important, and have life experiences that allow them to speak very nearly to those folks that are important to get in the trial. When you think about how that works with, say, many cancer trials, right? Often the first point of contact is the person caring for them, and may even be the person running that trial or bringing people into those trials in an academic center. You want those folks to be credible, trustworthy, in order to be successful in this. And then the next thing is recruiting practices. I think a few folks have mentioned this. If we want to have better representation in trials, we need to say it and we need to do it. We are running, I work in digital health. I work in a very sort of interesting intersection where I provide clinical expertise and support across our digital health initiatives. And that includes validating existing solutions, designing pilots and studies around our intended products and interventions, interfacing both with academia and with industry partners. But ultimately, for me, it's about clinical outcomes. It's about what patients and so have to know that we are out there looking to make sure they're represented, looking to be able to say, yes, this trial that indicated this benefit had a statistically significant and meaningful representation of who you are in that trial. And we need to be able to say that. And to get there, we need to be deliberate about doing it. I think also Jennifer mentioned going above and beyond. Because we live in a system and are all part of a system that's broken, and in our own ways, just doing that contributes to the status quo. In order to pull out of that, we all have to be thinking about how do we address these sort of the way that we struggle with this as a society in everything we do. So how do I make sure that I'm addressing the gaps in equity, the barriers to access that are there, and that I tacitly support by simply being in the society and paying taxes? How do I contribute to addressing those issues and being a part of the solution? So the way that we design trials, the way that we design interventions need to account for the unique perspectives, attitudes, and interactions of the people who are going to be using them in our society. I'll say one last point. The way we're doing that in my work is in digital health is we're really thinking about what the digital divide really means right now. We're reaching a point where that's no longer, at least in the United States, it's no longer an infrastructure issue. Most people, even those making the lowest income brackets, have access to mobile phones, have access to some form of internet. Broadband is a different situation, but that's rapidly improving. And so now it's about design, interface. It's about connecting with people where they are, making sure that what they see in front of them on a screen that's supposed to support their health and well-being engages them in a way that accounts for their culture, their language, their literacy, their design, the things that they respond to from an interface interaction. And so when we're looking at our digital tools, and one thing that we're studying right now is an intervention in asthma, in our asthma digital study, we wanted to be sure to recruit Medicaid cohorts in a very statistically significant manner to be sure and to be sure to recruit across geographies where we could be sure that we were going to have a good representation of various cohorts who use digital tools and would need them to be appropriately designed for their group. So thank you.
Thank you. That sounds comprehensive. Now, I wanted to ask our speakers, how did they get involved in this effort that they are undertaking? And can you, each one of you, speak to the results you've accomplished, thus far? Starting with Albert here.
Yeah, well, I have to admit that I'm pretty new to this, but I've always been interested in this area and always been interested in sectors where diversity is lacking, and also thinking about what is the true definition of an underrepresented minority. I don't think that I can say that I speak for my institution, but I think it's fair to say that we're only beginning to really address this in a meaningful way, and I think that's the administration would probably agree with that. And then you have to understand that there's multiple levels. There's an institutional level, there's a programmatic level, and then there's an individual level. And I would say, I'm a neuro-oncologist, a brain tumor specialist, and there's really some unique things about our patient population. So to be honest, until I started to shift and think about this, we have an unmet need where a lot of people have looked at, well, why are only 10% of your patients ever going into clinical trials in an area like glioblastoma, which is considered incurable, where we have lots of trials? So my mindset up until recently has been, well, I'm just happy if I get a patient into the trial. But now thinking about diversity, there's obviously things to be thinking about that are very challenging. And I think that what I would like to do moving forward is actually comparing the literature, which there's a significant body of knowledge already that people have written about, with our real world experience, and actually try to understand, tracking each one of our patients to see who successfully got into a trial and what are the patterns there, and who didn't get into a trial and what was the impediments there.
That's great. Greg, from your perspective, what were the reasons that you got involved, and how are your results going so far for work that you did?
So that's a terrific question. As I mentioned, I got involved because we started to see in national studies that there was this, big disparity in patient outcomes based on, race, ethnicity, and insurance status are kind of the big markers of that. And in pediatrics, our field is a little bit different from some of the other fields. One of the things that they looked at in terms of who was participating in the trials was essentially whether or not the providers recommended that they participate. We talked earlier about, having the providers kind of represent people in terms of their race and ethnicity. And I think that's part of building trust. People tend to assume that people from their background, are more likely to, maybe have their best interest in. But in peds, I think we build trust in families by showing them that we care about their kids. And I have a lot of kids and families where their parents are from very different backgrounds from me, but, they trust me. And when I recommend to them that they participate in trials, they do. And when I see that it's so different, I have come to believe that it's probably a lot of provider bias that drives it. There's a lot of articles within my field about talking about who's a good candidate to participate in a study or who's a good candidate to be on a device. And I think there's a whole lot of bad stuff tied up in the phrase good candidate. And one of my goals in participating in this is to kind of shatter that term. And then the other thing that has been helpful, a lot of bridging the gap has actually been digital health. It's been being able to offer these things by, a 30-minute Zoom visit rather than a 4-hour take off work, miss school, miss your hourly job, come in, have all this time off, and just kind of facilitating with families being able to work with us. And a big part of it has been regulators moving. Regulators used to create a lot of barriers, used to say, no, it has to be in person. You can't do it virtually. And then COVID happened. They said, oh, no, you have to do it virtually. We were like we've been asking for, great. And so I think that's been a big part. And the last thing that I'll mention, just because it hasn't really come up very much, in Colorado, our main kind of Caucasian population is Hispanic. And so language and Spanish becomes a big aspect for this. And typically IRBs and even FDA will say to us, everything has to be in English, and it has nothing to do with the benefit we're providing. And we are saying to them, please let us do it in English and Spanish and help us be successful with that rather than creating a barrier to it. And I think that's something that we've just started on that's going to be successful in terms of broadening who we're able to reach out to.
That's great. Jennifer, could you share your perspective, and then Siavash on the same topic?
Yes. Well, I would say this. My interest when it came to diversity and trials and medicine and science really started with my doctoral work, in which it was at University of Maryland, College Park, which it was a combination of genetics, looking at different race and ethnic groups when it came to hypertension. But I would say that the clinical-based experience was when I did my postdoc at UT Southwestern Medical Center in Dallas, Texas, in the Division of Hypertension, where our trials, we were in a setting, if anyone knows Parkland Hospital, is extremely diverse. It's very Black and brown. And we were doing antihypertensive therapy trials. And what was very interesting is that, I was a research fellow, African-American. My attending was an African-American female. The nurses were African-American females. And we were in this environment where we did create this trust. Now, Greg, I do agree with you. When it comes to pediatrics, I think it's different because I'm a mom of a young child. And if your pediatrician loves your kid, you're good. I don't care who they are. But it seems like with adults, and especially with chronic illness, what we were seeing is that we had created this environment where patients felt very trusted and seen and cared for. And I remember even the trial patients telling us that, like, you just take such good care of me. You care for me. You listen to me. You hear me. And so I think that's a huge element. So if I cut forward to where we are here at Abbott and the trial work that we have been doing, and one of them has been with, it's called Life BTK, which is to treat patients with CLI. And it's a new therapy we're evaluating against standard of care. One of the elements that we found was very important is that we ensure that some of the physicians that are part of our trials, which has not always been traditionally in our trials, are those of diverse backgrounds. And so we have had Latina vascular surgeons, African-American vascular surgeons, and some other ethnic groups that have just had an interest and focus on the community, because there is, like, we've called it kind of a care cocoon where the patient feels like, okay, they are invested in me. I don't, the fears that I have about the healthcare system and whether that I will be exploited are potentially minimized because of the care dynamics that is created. And so that's been some of our investment in how do we help the next generation of researchers, nurses, to be available to these communities to conduct medical research. Because right now, if I think about all the specialties, and many of you have these, different subspecialties, and I think of the pool of physicians of color, the pool of physicians of color is very small. And then when I ask for a vascular surgeon, interventional radiologist, interventional cardiologist, it becomes minuscule. And so how am I to help serve the patient population with, a healthcare system that supports them when there are limitations on who is there available for them?
That's good. Siavash?
So I, for a long time, I mean, going back to my years developing as a teenager, and I've always been very, for whatever reason, maybe experiences as an immigrant or as sort of having gone from living among a great deal of poverty and strife to seeing and experiencing a great deal of privilege. For whatever reason it may be, this has always been an issue, and that I've felt attached to. And when I came into healthcare and started to notice the problems around health disparities, around critical access to services, really started to think about what drives a lot of the experience that Black and Brown people, LGBTQIA communities, and other sort of marginalized groups, for whatever the reason may be. I started, always thought about how to address those. And then I got interested in digital health and started to look at this thing that, it could be really helpful to a lot of people, but is very tied to what you have access to, and very tied to technology and things, right? And ultimately to education and literacy and all of that. And I really started to see, well, if we don't deliberately develop this tool and look at this ecosystem in a way that accounts for some of those access barriers, some of the discrepancies in power and privilege between certain groups, we're only going to worsen these disparities. We're going to make things, it's only going to be a bigger problem. So when I had the opportunity to join Anthem and think about really how we can address digital health at scale and think about how to design and then validate and evaluate these tools in a way that drives outcomes for as many people as possible, I was drawn to the idea of being able to bring that point of view into things like, as I mentioned, our asthma study that's recruiting across the country, our development of telemedicine and telehealth resources and health plans that leverage those, being sure that they are accessible in the right ways that allow people to be private, autonomous, and heard and feel heard. So that's really where it comes from, and hoping to be able to drive some change there.
Great. Thank you. So to summarize it for our audience and what all the insights that you've shared, we have a lot of gaps in diversity and inclusion within our clinical research programs across the country. And they relate to awareness, access, abilities, financial reasons, bias, implicit bias, especially, and then certainly trust or lack thereof. So the question, though, is that what do we need? What do we need to do to go from here? What do we do in the short term, and what do we need to do in the long term to improve this? And maybe we can get a perspective from academia first with Albert and Greg, and then from industry with Jennifer and Siavash.
Yeah, I think, from where I perceive my level is and where UCLA is and probably other institutions, I think that it actually starts with awareness, and then prioritization, and then an integrated way of really wanting to do this, like really doing it. And I think that that's going to be really important. Just for one example, I serve on the peer review scientific committee that we review all of the cancer trials. And just recently, we will be asking, in addition to all the information about the trial, we will be asking for a diversity enrollment plan from every investigator. And I've been on this committee for 13 years, and this is the first time we're including something like that. And I think it would be naive to say that, that one little thing is going to help, that's going to cure the problem. But I think we raise awareness and then start to say, well, this really is important. We're going to make you do these things. And then ultimately, the plan will not just be a few sentences, will be actually a real plan, and maybe we'll even have an office that actually helps you do that. So I think there's just so much to do, but I think it starts with awareness and prioritization, and then involving as disparate people, such as the ethical issue of how far can I go to get a patient all the way to the clinical trial center and not cross that boundary of actually, is this person actually doing this with, have they consented and this is their autonomous decision? So I think there's just so much to go forward with, but I think it's extremely exciting. And I think I really believe it is really important from a scientific area, healthcare bias issues, just on every level. So I think it's definitely worthwhile. We need to convince everybody, all the stakeholders, that it is actually important.
Greg, anything more you want to add from an academia standpoint as to what we need to do in the short term?
Long term. I agree. In the short term, one of the first things we can do is try and become more aware of our own implicit biases. I've reflected on that myself. If I have a family come in and, one of the parents is a physician, another one's an engineer, I'm going to be like, oh, you'll be really excited about this research. But then I have another family come in where, they're both, hourly job workers. And I say, oh, well, maybe they can't handle hearing about this, and challenging yourself and saying, I'm not going to use the same language because I don't want to talk over someone's head, but I want to tell everyone about this and see how excited they get. And then you're surprised, right? You're surprised, sometimes the physician's like, oh no, I do research, I wouldn't put my kid through that. And then another family's like, oh, that's cool, I want to do the newest thing. So, challenging those biases that we all hold in our heads. And then I think the other big part, though, and Albert talked about this, at an institutional level, is, making this a priority. And one of the things that we haven't discussed as kind of a barrier to that, which is it does take more time. And I actually do research with Abbott Diabetes already. So I work with them as one of my industry partners. And one of the things that we need to consider is, if we're reaching out to people who are maybe less interested in research or less aware of research, you might have to make 50% more calls to hit your number. You might have to spend 3 months longer recruiting in order to get the target that you're going for. And we all agree with this philosophically, but that's one of the institutional challenges that we run into, is saying, we agree with it philosophically, now we need to agree with it financially. And, making our industry partners and our academic partners saying, if we're really going to prioritize this, it has to be a priority all throughout the thing, not just in a nice flowery paragraph. And I think that's where we're really coming to now, is saying, do we need to hire a Spanish-speaking nurse to work on this project? Do we need to put more resources into it to actually achieve this goal? Because if it were easy, we'd already done it. So that's kind of my opinion on what else needs to be done. It gets a little bit to stakeholders question, but I'll come back to it.
So Jennifer and Siavash, from an industry standpoint, do you feel that those are also the short-term and long-term goals you have?
Oh, yes, I do agree with number one, the awareness and the prioritization. I think the third one, which Greg was getting to, is the resources. Because I can have all the awareness in the world and think it's important, but let's be very clear. If I financially cannot support this, it will not work. Abbott has had to make an intentional investment in this work, in the conduct of our trials, in which we had to pay for resources, not only design them, but pay for these resources that, number one, supported translation services, had transportation service, home health services for patients, so that they didn't have to come back for their clinical visits. Even developing platforms, you all speak of digital health. We saw how important it was for us to have a single source of reliable information for patients on the web. So we have a very well done LifeBTK website for this one trial, and we've done videos and all these things, because we can't just speak it, but we actually have to put the investment in it. And regarding the long term, this problem didn't show up. People's awareness just showed up, but this problem has been embedded in the kind of the culture of where we are for a long time. Health inequities are long lasting. And so for us to now have the awareness and the prioritization is wonderful. However, we will not be able to unravel this quickly. And it's going to take repeated work. And it's really a marathon of work, where there will be a time saying, I'm investing, but I'm not seeing as much as movement as I want. But actually being patient and understanding that, as we all are in our jobs and careers or practice, it actually may be not you, but the next generation behind you that is actually going to see the shift, where they say, oh, you know what? Well, we have to have a D&I plan. Okay, 10 years ago, no one was talking about D&I plan. But now we have to have a D&I plan. Oh, did you see that the trial numbers that, a third of the patients or half of the patients are patients of color, where before it was 5 to 10%. It's going to be a metric. Metrics will have to follow, but they will take time for us to see the gain that we want. And we have to be patient.
No, that's great. So excellent points. And I think you're right that, and not very many trials do that, but we need to budget for those kind of resources for patient participation as well, and not just for provider or investigator participation. So thanks for sharing those perspectives. Siavash, anything more from your perspective?
Well, sort of going back to two of the things I mentioned earlier, one around recruiting practices and one around trialist representation. I think those can be thought of as short-term and long-term goals, in that much like a number of folks have said, recruiting practices, right? There are very quick, easy things we can do to get more representation into trials. It involves resources, and it involves getting to where patients are. I think Albert mentioned at the beginning of the talk that we largely operate on a who walks through the door model. So that Black and Brown, LGBTQIA, and other marginalized groups are less likely to walk through those doors, whether they are able or not able to get there, right? Like even folks who have the means to get to those doors, who are in those groups, are less likely to walk through them. So what does that mean? That means we have to get into neighborhoods. We have to create allies, credible messengers. We have to, I work in the emergency department, and we know that people of diverse backgrounds are more likely to use the emergency department for run-of-the-mill day-to-day healthcare needs. I don't ever see anybody in my EDs recruiting for clinical trials, right? Unless they're emergency or trauma trials, right? And that seems like low-hanging fruit. Just look for the big room on the first floor that smells weird, right? And so we need to be thinking about these ways of getting into communities and into where people are and where they go. And then trialist representation. I mean, I think this is really a systemic issue. This touches on how we provide education to young people and influence the fields that they want to go to, all the way up to our hiring practices, human resources practices. And this is something that's a multi-generational project. And so I think in the long term, we need to think about the steps to get people into the jobs, people who are out there now to get into the jobs and the positions, and support talent that is going to address the problem. And then being sure that with the generations that follow, we are talking about these problems. We are saying what really the issue is, and that we're providing education, support, and resources where it's needed in order to get more people that better represent the patients that we care for and the members that we want to support across all groups into those positions, because there's policy decisions that need to get made that are influenced by the biases people have, and we need equal representation. There's resource decisions that need to get made. There are trial designs and innovations there that need to be made, that need to get done, and all of those need broad input from life perspectives and expertise that is informed by the kinds of things that build trust and credibility among the ultimate, as we say in my digital health world, end user.
Thank you again. And so, what role do stakeholders in healthcare, and by stakeholders I mean it's all the listeners that are in the audience who have an interest in healthcare, and they might be part of the government, part of the provider network, payer network, consultants, industry, all the stakeholders in healthcare. What role do they need to play to ensure continued progress? Albert?
Well, I think that as is that there's just so much to be done. And I think that to really get people passionate about doing things wherever they hold that stake, they have to first of all be convinced of the importance of it. And I think, again, from a disparity issue, from a biology and scientific issue, I think it's absolutely clear that we do need to be addressing this problem. And then it's important, then the awareness needs to be made. And then everybody chips in from, where they are. So we see from my vantage point as an academician, as someone who's on the front line actually enrolling patients, that, we talked about implicit bias. We talked about having ethics look into making sure we do things correctly. We talk about having our institution not only be supportive, but put nudges in place to make us think about it more, collaborating, amongst silos to actually do this. Reading the literature to understand cultural differences, why there may be distrust, what are the impacts of the second languages, what are the impacts of lack of access, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's just so many attack points, and I think that thinking about it in an integrated way, and then figuring out how we can all make a difference. I actually don't think it'll be that hard to identify those areas. It's actually plugging ourselves into that and making those differences.
Greg?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of things. When I've talked to my industry partners about this, one of the things I bring up is money is a great way to motivate people. And so if one of my industry partners that I'm doing a trial with says, you have a financial incentive, tied to hitting this recruitment benchmark, you're going to work towards that. If NIH says, if you want to get the full money for this grant, you have to hit this recruitment benchmark, you're going to prioritize that. Now, obviously, there's an ethics and a yin and a yang.
Yeah, I think there's such an ethical, I just see it, and I think we need an ethics group, working group to actually help us maneuver that, because otherwise I think it'd be really problematic.
Yeah, so there's an ethics side to that, but, having on the, investigator side, the financials tied to it would be a driver. And obviously you want it to be a positive one, not one that creates a worse evil than what you're trying to prevent to begin with. And then the other thing, like I said, is the regulator side. Right now, we routinely hear from FDA, in order to, have Spanish materials, you have to have, an N that's equal to your original N, and it becomes, financially disadvantageous to do it. You guys were talking about, if a trial is paying for transportation, is that coercive? If you're doing virtual visits, is that adequate supervision? And these are all trade-offs. And if we know that not hitting our, representation recruitment goals are tied to some of these things, where are we going to flex in other areas? But then this is what I'm saying. It's a very hard problem. What's the challenge with that? Or what's the trade-off with that? Is the trade-off acceptable? And I think my opinion is we've been too restrictive for a lot of these things for a long time. And we haven't acknowledged where, technology is. 5 years ago, it would have been insulting to do this conference virtually. And now we all agreed that it's the best way to do it. So things change. And, I think that especially on the regulatory side and the payer side, that's where you're really going to see movement. I think in academics, we're interested in it. Obviously in policy and advocacy, people have been very interested in it for a very long time, but regulation and funding are going to be the places that really move it.
So from our industry colleagues, Jennifer and Siavash, what are your thoughts around the role for the stakeholders, all our listeners, what can they do to help?
I was trying to, when I was looking at this question, I was thinking, okay, who are our stakeholders? I think there's so many of them. And I do think there is one thing that I think, Albert, that you mentioned is just really understanding first what biases exist within each of these systems. Okay, so there's going to be biases within the healthcare system, academics, within industry. And so how do we understand, number one, that we hold these implicit biases and that we will have to actually, pivot from them and identify, okay, now that we see them, how are we going to make the change? I would also say, though, when I look at the regulations, Greg, you mentioned the regulators, and, FDA has been knocking on our door for a long time, industry. Since their 1998 demographic rule, which they asked for subgroup analysis by age, gender, ethnicity, that's when it began. And they put out their guidance in 2020, and they, which they again are the guidance on diversity and inclusion in clinical trials. And in that, one of their first paragraphs, they really do mention in so many ways, in a soft way, but the frustration with all the, the ask of these last, so many years, and we haven't really shifted. And what I see that will help shift, I would say many of us in industry, is that it's, being held accountable, and which I think FDA is starting to do, and which, okay, well, let's make sure your subgroup analysis is an IFU, or is it in the SSCD, which is public facing. And so this will, in so many ways, does put academic or industry researchers in a position. They say, how are we going to be more intentional about making this change such that we are in line more of what the regulators, FDA and NIH, want? Many times change is not really made unless there's pressure. And so we want the pressure to be positive, and we do want that everybody is very open and to see how important diversity and inclusion in trials is impactful and important for the overall healthcare system. But we probably are going to have to be uncomfortable to make that shift.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I know you've identified Jennifer and I as sort of industry, right? But I think that the lines between these things, particularly when you start talking about large health systems that are academic, that are part of academic institutions, those lines, I think blur. But aside from my little editorial there, the reason I say that is, I work at Anthem, and as in my non-clinical role or sort of non-patient care role, I should say. And in my patient care role, I have, relationships with UCSF and other large non-academic physician groups. And the common thread between these as a concept is we all all of these groups play a big role in ultimately what ends up being in the hands of patients, of individuals, and are arbiters of trust in various ways. So these are institutions, large organizations who can say and do things that are extremely influential. And when it comes to therapeutics and when it comes to innovation, there, I think, is something to be said for saying we will partner with the people who are creating the best solutions to this problem. And we know that representation solves a big problem. We know that having diversity and inclusion in clinical trials can help address health disparities, can help address the problems that are rooted in health inequity. And so if we know that to be the problem, and we are representatives and people in very influential financially, politically, culturally, those institutions can say it's important to us to be working with people who are doing the best work to solve this problem. And so when we're talking about this, we're talking about organizations that have good representation in their leadership, that have validated their tools and innovations among the appropriate groups, are generalizable, have accounted for social barriers in optimizing care and optimizing therapeutics, addressing bias in things like diagnostics and codes and algorithms, et cetera. So doing that, I think, is going to be really influential. And we're making progress there. And I think some really great institutions that I'm a part of and not a part of are taking a leadership in this, and that's what it's going to take.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, because all of you shared some excellent opportunities that exist for all of us to participate as key stakeholders in improving the diversity and inclusion in our clinical trials, and that will eventually improve the outcomes for our patients as well. And we have several questions from the audience, and we may have just time for one question. Others will certainly post and provide answers to those. But one quick question, if you can answer for us, is: have you and or your organization made efforts to educate the community at large to improve diversity and inclusion amongst participants in clinical studies? And if so, what do you feel has worked in educating the community at large?
So that's a very interesting and challenging topic. One of the things we've done at Barbara Davis Center, I have a colleague who started up our specifically dedicated Latino program, and she has gone out and done community outreach to help connect families with kind of a full Spanish-speaking program. There's a similar program in San Francisco, I know, within their diabetes center. And that has really helped to sort of bring in patients and families, bring in kind of a sense of community there. And then it establishes some of that trust. And now we're able to kind of connect those families with, trusted providers in the language that the parents speak about participation in clinical research. So it's not exactly engaging the community on the whole concept of DEI in this sense, but it is engaging kind of a specific stakeholder community in the efforts that our center is taking and doing it in a way that's appropriate for them and having them give feedback on what they want rather than us telling them what they should want. That doesn't work.
Yeah, thanks, Brent. Go ahead.
I mean, we do a free patient conference every year. It's well received and well attended, but it's very ad hoc in terms of this issue. And so I think that partly it has to do with the rarity of the disease that I treat and enroll patients in trials. But again, it's who walks in the door. It's not trying to target a certain population or go into that specific community. So I think everything just needs to be thought of through a different prism, and maybe looking at it from the diversity prism, we might do things differently.
And Jennifer and Siavash, from Abbott and Anthem side, what might be you be doing to educate the community?
Right now, we don't have a direct program that is out in the community, but definitely discussions on how we take that to the next step and who we partner with. You know, some of these medical, we have some relationships that we've started through scholarship support to historically Black colleges and universities that have medical schools. And so the thought is, can we do outreach programs working with these institutions to discuss basically just its education on certain chronic conditions and what therapeutic options are available.
Yeah, I think the Anthem Foundation supports a number of initiatives around education in health literacy and health systems navigation. I think we have a developing community health oriented organization that's looking to partner with CBOs and really generate a direct connection between trusted partners within communities in order to be an education source. So making progress there. And Albert, I really love UCSF does this wonderful thing and there's so many like world-class scientists there. They have a program where they actually get these guys up in front of everyday folks to talk in sort of layperson lecture style around specific health issues. And it's actually a really nice program and gets a lot of attention. I think things like that are valuable to do.
That's great. Well, I want to thank all our panelists for sharing their experiences and some really valuable insights over here. And also want to thank our audience, our listeners, for joining in. John, anything else we would want to add over here? I think we're out of time.
I want to express my gratitude as well to you and all our panelists. Thank you all for joining for a great panel discussion today on this important topic. So thank you very much.